A few months ago, I was asked to join a healthcare company in designing its AI ethics program. They had already been doing it in house, been doing quite a bit of research, and they had a design workshop that they wanted me to speak at and participate in. This is a large organization. They have over 20,000 doctors and they see over 5 million patients a year. So we're not talking about a small impact. Not only is it, of course, that they affect so many people, but it's healthcare. So we're literally talking about life and death. Now, one of the things that they did that I thought was really interesting is that they did their research. And one of the things that they were thinking about in the context of designing and implementing an AI ethics program is to think about how do we bring equity into how we think about AI ethics. So, how do we think about equity in healthcare? They had shared with me an article that I read. It's called A Proposed Framework on Integrating Health Equity and Racial Justice into the Artificial Intelligence Development Lifecycle. It's a mouthful, but essentially, how do we get health equity into AI that's going to be designed and deployed in a healthcare setting? This was in the Journal of Healthcare for the Poor and Underserved. It was published in 2021 by doctors Irene Dankwa and Elizabeth Lee Schoifella. I think I'm saying that, and a host of others. I'll link to this in the podcast description. So here's what the general claim was. The general claim, of course, is that as AI gets developed, especially in high-risk circumstances during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is what their article focuses on, we really need to figure out how to integrate considerations of equity into the design, development, and deployment of AI. Here's a quote from them. Quote, "The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on racial, ethnic, minority, and socially disadvantaged populations underscores the need to anticipate and address social inequalities and health disparities in AI development and application." Okay. Now, there's some ways in which this is obviously true. This is obviously right. So here's two very quick examples, one not AI related and one AI related. For a non-AI related example, just think about pulse oximeters. Those are those little things that people put on their fingers to measure the amount of oxygen in their blood. And this was important, of course, because if the numbers were low, this was a symptom and a warning sign that you've got COVID and you're not doing well with it. So it's important that these things work well. Unfortunately, what was discovered is that these things don't work well, or at least they didn't at the time, work well on people with darker skin. It's because they use certain kinds of lights on the skin and they weren't trained or it wasn't developed for darker skinned people. And so it just turned up worse results. And so that's no good. We want to create tools that work equally well for all people, races, etc. Here's another example, this one from Optum Healthcare. This was published or reported about in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, that they created an AI algorithm that recommended to doctors and nurses to pay more attention to white patients than to sicker black patients. So these are things that are clearly bad. Clearly, we need to guard against these kinds of things. And to that extent, I think that the authors of this article are absolutely right. That said, we do need to think really clearly about what equity amounts to. Is it always something that we should pursue? Does the pursuit of healthcare equity sometimes require moral sacrifices that are too great? Of course, I ask this question because I think that there's reason to think that the answer is yes. And the rationale behind that comes from another article, not shared with me, incidentally, by that healthcare company. This was an article that appeared in the journal Bioethics by Guha, Krishnamurthi, and Eric Vogelstein. Sorry, doctors. They have PhDs. I could poke a little bit of fun at them and not calling them doctors since A, they have PhDs in philosophy, as do I, and B, they're both my good friends. At any rate, Guha and Eric argue that sometimes, at least, concerns of equity should be outweighed by other ethical concerns. Sometimes equity is not worth it, given the context and what's at stake. And just in case you're wondering, as you might be, given the sort of political landscape we occupy, these are generally people on the left side of politics, so we're not talking about a kind of far-right critique of equity or anything along those lines. Guha and Eric both think that exactly what I said earlier, which is that we should not have discriminatory AI or biased AI in a variety of contexts. But the question is whether equity is always worth it, or is it sometimes outweighed by other ethical concerns? Okay, that's what this episode is about. My name is Reed Blackman, and on Ethical Machines, this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take a critical look at the value of equity in healthcare. All that said, If you like the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe, give a 5-star review, write a review, share it with your friends, do all the things that all the people tell you're supposed to do with things that you like. All right, let's talk more about equity in healthcare and whether it's always worth it. All right, let's dive into this article a little bit anyway about the framework for integrating health equity and racial justice into AI development. I read you a quote by these authors earlier. I'll give you one more. Here we go. Quote, when developing AI-based solutions in healthcare, anticipating and addressing potential health disparity concerns is imperative. These concerns must be consciously and appropriately accommodated, or health disparities among racial and ethnic minority and other socially vulnerable populations will continue to widen. Equity and justice principles in the continuum of AI design, development, and use are paramount and foundational. End quote. That all seems fair enough. We need to address disparities in the kinds of healthcare that we provide to people of different races, ethnicities, genders, etc. We want to try to close the gap in the way that these different groups get treated. But now let's take a look at an article by Dr. Eric Vogelstein and Dr. Guha Krishnamurthi. And I just realized, actually, that Guha does not have a PhD in philosophy. He was getting a PhD. He was in the PhD program, but then he only got a master's in philosophy, and then he went on to get a JD and become a professor of law. So, actually, Guha, I take it back. You're not a doctor. All right. Anyway, so the title of their article is Equity and COVID-19 Treatment Allocation, a Questionable Criterion. So, look, here's the deal. This is in the context of COVID-19, obviously, in particular in the context of having to distribute vaccines for COVID-19, which, of course, at least at the time, was a very scarce resource. So I want to be clear here. This critique of using equity as a criterion for how we distribute resources is in the context of this very limited resource of a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, there's going to be certain questions about the extent to which we can generalize from this. But at the very least, I think that if you see the argument that they have to offer, you can see how we need to think about the extent to which equity should play a role in our healthcare decisions, and relatedly, how equity should play a role in AI design development. Notice I said how it should play a role, not whether. So it should sometimes play a role, for instance, if discrimination is on the line, but it's not always clear that it ought to. So the primary question that Eric and Guha are after is this: should we use equity as a criterion for distributing scarce resources like in a pandemic context? So here's a quote from them. Quote, equity-included allocation schemes prioritize, to some degree, patients from marginalized or historically disadvantaged racial or ethnic groups, or patients with low socioeconomic status for scarce treatment. The use of such criteria has been prominently defended as a form of remedial justice, that is, as a way of redressing disparities in COVID outcomes that are caused by underlying unjust social conditions. So again, we've got this limited resource. We have to distribute it across very diverse population. Arguably, we should give it to those people who have been historically marginalized, to those people of lower socioeconomic status. And the reason we should give it to those people is that their health conditions, which makes them more high risk for very bad outcomes from having COVID, is caused by underlying unjust social conditions. You might call, as one kind of example that everyone is familiar with, systematic racism or systemic racism. Okay. Now, it's clear that mitigating the disparity, closing that gap, is morally important. There's no question whether it's more important. It's morally important. How close that gap has to get for it to be just, that's another subtle area of inquiry, but at the very least, we can say, and Eric and Guha do say this, that the goal is just. But then they ask a perfectly normal question with which we're all familiar. Does the end justify the means? Or more specifically, does the end always justify the means? Because as they point out, and I'll give the rationale in a second, if in the distribution of a vaccine, you prioritize the historically marginalized who have historically and presently worse health outcomes, then you're going to lose more lives. So here's what they say, quote, we need not be coy about what equity-included allocation schemes entail. they mean that some people who stand to benefit more from treatment will be passed up so that the treatment can go to members of the disadvantaged groups in question. The result, given that the allocation applies to life-saving treatment, is that more people will die in order to satisfy the demands of equity. Okay, now you might wonder, why would that be? Why would it be the case that in pursuing equity and trying to close the healthcare gap, we would actually kill more people or more people would die? Why would that be the case? Why is that sacrifice necessary? And here's the rationale. Eric and Guha ask us to imagine just two patients. Let's call them patients A and patient B, each of whom have a 10% chance of survival without any treatment. But now let's suppose that patient A has a 75% chance of survival with treatment, and patient B has a 50% chance of survival with the treatment. Okay, so patient A is more likely to respond positively to the treatment than patient B. And let's also suppose that patient B is a member of a historically marginalized group. Now, if what you did is you said, look, okay, patient A is a white dude with a 75% chance of survival, patient B has a 50% chance of survival, and let's say it's a black person, we should give it to patient B, even though they're less likely to get a positive outcome, because they're a member of a historically marginalized group and we owe them certain kinds of recompense or remediation for unjust social conditions. Okay, if you do that and you scale this, so it's not just A and B, but it's A and B and C and D and E, F, you do this at scale, let's say across your 5 million plus patients, what you will wind up with is more deaths. And that's because the people to whom you're prioritizing have a less of a chance of benefiting from that medication. And so you're going to get more dead white people than the alternative. So either you get more lives saved overall, where disproportionately those people are white, or you get fewer people saved, so more death, but more members of historically marginalized groups are saved. The point of this is not to say this is the wrong thing to do or this is the right thing to do. This is not an argument for whether or not equity should be included in how we think we ought to distribute life-saving scarce resources. It's just to say, hey, this is at least a big question, right? We're talking about not saving as many lives as we could. And maybe that's the right thing to do, but you got to make an argument for that claim. That's a highly contentious claim. Here's another quote from Eric and Guha, quote, "We must be able to explain clearly and convincingly why disparity mitigation is more morally important than saving lives. Why is this end quote. Why is disparity mitigation more morally important than saving lives?" That's a tough question. And it's one that we've got to face, and we can't just say because of equity, because the very question is pursuing equity in this particular circumstance worth the moral cost of the extra lives lost? Okay, so that's where we are so far. We are at a place where we're wondering whether, as one might put it, whether the juice is worth the squeeze, whether pursuing equity is worth the extra lost lives. And now we're going to go into an argument that Guha and Eric give for thinking, actually, it's not just to prioritize the person by virtue of equity considerations, and that we should prioritize maximizing lives saved. So here's the argument. And again, you might agree with Eric and Guha up until this point and say it's a worthy question, and maybe now you don't disagree with their argument. Maybe now you disagree with their argument, but let's go see if you do. Let's see what that argument is. So here's what it's called. And some of you might have heard something like the trolley problem. They're going to give you a trolley problem kind of case. If you haven't heard it before, that's okay. You probably heard it in the context of like self-driving cars, but that's not relevant here. Okay, so here's the argument. I want you to suppose, this is Eric and Guha talking, I want you to suppose that a trolley is headed down a track to which a person A has been unjustly tied. All right, so A is unjustly tied to the tracks. And A can't get out of the way. The trolley is going to kill him. But if you flip a switch, then the trolley will go down a different track, and there are two other people there, B and C. And B and C aren't there due to an injustice, but B and C sort of got unlucky, right? Maybe they were both walking on the train tracks, and they both tripped, or they were walking next to it, they tripped or something like that, or a strong wind came, or whatever happened. A deer came out, they jumped, now they're stuck on the tracks, whatever the story is, doesn't matter. So B and C are both stuck on the track as well, and it's not their fault that they're stuck there. It's really bad luck. And you can flip the switch. Again, the train is going towards A, who has been unjustly tied. You didn't do it. B and C are also tied to train tracks due to just really bad luck, not due to anything you've done, should you flip the switch? Or should anyone flip that switch and kill B and C instead of A? And Eric and Guha say, you shouldn't flip the switch, ethically speaking. Here's a quote: "The fact that the cause of A being stuck on the track was the unjust actions of a third party, while the cause of B and C being stuck on the track was bad luck, that's irrelevant to one's obligations to save the most lives." So, yes, A is there for unjust circumstances, B and C are there for bad luck circumstances, but you should nonetheless not flip the switch and kill two people instead of having one person die. Okay, that's the sort of thought experiment. Maybe you find that plausible in general. Here's the thing. Here's one kind of objection that you might offer. Look, B and C aren't all that innocent. The person who is A, who is unjustly tied to that track, society put him there, right? This is a sort of a reference to systemic racism or some such thing. Society put him there, and to that extent, and B and C are part of society, and so they're somehow responsible in some broad sense, or part of the responsible entity, society, that put A unjustly on those tracks. And for that reason, arguably, you should flip the switch. And here's Erica Guha's response. In general, individual members of society are not liable for the unjust social conditions that result in disparate COVID outcomes between advantage and disadvantages, racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups. So that's a way of saying, look, in this case, even if society put A on the tracks and B and C are a member of society, is this massive thing. B and C are dust in the wind. They're very small parts of the whole of society. They probably had no idea that society was doing that to A, or they certainly didn't intend for society to do that to A or anything of that sort. And if someone is not liable, if those individuals are not liable for the injustice, then they're not morally obligated to sacrifice their lives. Here in the COVID context, we're talking, of course, about, say, a white patient who's also at the hospital, or a couple of or a few white patients who are also at the hospital who haven't done nothing particularly ethically egregious to create systemic racism or something like that, as though one or two individuals could do such a thing. They're members in a link of a very long historical causal chain. They're only a small part of the whole of society. So it can't be the case that those patients, this so goes the argument, are required to sacrifice their lives because they're a member of society that put people of color, the historically marginalized, in overall worse health outcomes. And even if you do think, this is a point that, again, Guha and Eric make, even if you do think that they do bear some responsibility, that's not to say that their obligations are automatically, then you've got to sacrifice your life. They might have some obligations or other, but to sacrifice one's life is the biggest sacrifice. And so even if they have a moral obligation in some broad sense to help mitigate the disparity in healthcare allocation generally, that obligation is to do other kinds of things, like maybe vote for political candidates that would support certain kinds of taxation policies or distribution policies that would help the historically marginalized. But an obligation to vote for such kinds of candidates is not the same, obviously, as an obligation to sacrifice your life for it. So what's the big picture here? The big picture is that it might be the case that equity considerations should determine how we distribute healthcare's limited resources, and that these kinds of things should work their way into how we design, develop, and use AI in the healthcare setting. But it's questionable exactly how equity should be included. Is it always the case that anything that pursues equity should be pursued? It should be overridden? Should it, in the words of that first article, should it be, quote, paramount and foundational? I'm doubtful. I think that Eric and Guha have given a strong reason to think that, at least in some circumstances, there should not be equity, or equity should not be the primary or foundational or always overriding consideration in how we allocate resources. Now, This is, of course, contentious. I'm not saying this is the final word. First of all, I've given you small quotes from each article. Both articles have more subtlety and more complexity than I've presented here. And there's, of course, more and more to be said and argued about. At the very least, though, I hope that what I've shown you is that you can't just say the word equity in healthcare and say, yes, pursue that, put that into AI, and we're done here. How we think about equity at a more granular level, when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate to pursue it, given the context and what's at stake, is a very difficult, context-sensitive, complex ethical question. And so anyone looking to create an AI ethics program, or people, average citizens who are thinking about what the healthcare system ought to look like, what kind of political candidates they ought to vote for, given how they're going to shape the healthcare environment, we have to think really carefully about them, because if we make the wrong choices, either way, we're talking about tremendous moral sacrifice. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.